In the last lesson, we discussed a few camera settings such as Filmback, or in simple words, sensor size. We discussed focus settings, focal length, and aperture as well. And we also discussed how all these settings are somehow interlinked with each other, okay? In this lesson, I'm going to show you what settings do we have for this particular shot and why. So let's begin. Now, what I'm going to do in here is to simply just enlarge this window. I'm going to select this camera that I have in the scene for the sake of demonstration. And I'm going to now place this camera at exactly the same spot as this one. Let me just split this window and adjust the frame number. I'm going to move this playhead to, let's say, 45. I'm going to hide this cover. Okay. And I'm going to select this camera in here. I'm going to copy the rotation values and paste them in here. And I'm gonna copy the location values as well. And select this camera and paste them here. Okay. Now we have two cameras at exactly the same spot with exactly the same orientation. One of them is this one, Cine Camera Actor 0, the one that we have for our shot. And the second camera, Cine Camera Actor 1, is in the scene just for the sake of demonstration. So let me now go into perspective mode and select Cine Camera Actor 1. Let me change this to cinematic. And I'm gonna have camera number 0, one that we have for our shot, on the left-hand side. And I'm gonna have the second camera on the right-hand side. So I'm gonna now select the demo camera, and I'm gonna reset all these values so that we can begin from scratch. And the only value that I'm gonna tweak in here is the focal length and the focus method. I'm gonna have to adjust the focus method because, of course, I have to focus on this camera to show you the demonstration. I'm gonna now uncheck this box, and in order to have the same field of view as this one, I'm gonna have to set the squeeze factor to 2 and set the focal length of the camera to maybe just about there, I think. Yeah, now it looks good. Let me bring this window down because I don't need this one for today's video. Today's video is going to be all about demonstration. We're not going to do any sort of settings in here, so I just need you to focus on this video. So now, as you can see that we have pretty much the default settings in here for this camera that we have for the sake of demonstration in the scene. The only few things that I changed in here is the focal length so that I have exactly the same field of view. And I had to adjust the focus as well so that you can easily understand these concepts. And I set the squeeze factor to 2 so that we have the same field of view for both of the shots, okay? Yeah, so if I now select this camera, the one that we have for our shot, you can now see that in here, I've set the Filmback settings to IMAX 70mm. I do have other options in here as well. By default, it is set to 16:9 digital film, but for some reason, I have IMAX 70mm. Why is that? Just a small reminder in here, we have already adjusted all these settings in the previous lessons, but in that particular lesson, I quickly just adjusted all these settings, and I said that for the moment, you just need to adjust all these settings, and then in the later video, I'm going to explain it to you why I'm choosing these settings or why I'm adjusting these parameters. So in today's video, I'm going to show you why I did that, okay? So you can now see in here that for the Filmback, I have selected IMAX 70mm. If I select this camera 1, that I have for the sake of demonstration, you can see by default it is set to 16:9 digital film. So why did I choose an IMAX 70mm instead of the default setting? Let me show you why. Now in here you can see that as far as horizontal field of view is concerned, I really hope at this point you know what horizontal and vertical field of view is. Horizontal field of view is the distance from here to here, and the vertical field of view is the distance from here to here, okay? So for this particular shot, as far as horizontal field of view is concerned, you can see that the horizontal field of view is roughly the same for both of these shots. You can see I have this asset in here. It has this yellowish sort of part in here. I can see that the yellowish part in here as well. Same is the case for this radar or antenna or whatever you want to call this. We can see both of them in here as well. As far as horizontal field of view is concerned, it is roughly the same for both of these shots, okay? The only difference in here seems to be the vertical field of view. You can see if I select this asset, I can clearly see this asset in here, but on the right hand side, you can see that the image is somehow cropped at the moment and I don't see this complete model of the spaceship. Same is the case in here as well. If I select this asset, you can see that on the left hand side, I can completely see this particular tower or pillar, whatever you want to call this. And I can see the second one as well. But on the right hand side, you can see I can just see the bottom part of this asset at the moment. Same is the case for the second one as well. So the problem somehow seems to be with the vertical field of view. Same is the case for this character as well. If I select this character, you can see I can barely see anything below his neck in here. But on the left hand side with IMAX 70mm, I can see this part of the character in here. So this is the advantage of using IMAX over, let's say, digital film or any other narrow lens, because IMAX gives you a much wider field of view vertically and horizontally, which gives you very cinematic looking results. Okay. Because if I select this camera in here, which has the IMAX, the one that we have for our shot, you can see that the sensor width is 70mm and the sensor height is 56mm at the moment. Okay. But if I select the other camera that I have for the sake of demonstration, by default, for this particular lens, you can see that I have the sensor width of 23 and sensor height of 13. This is a pretty small lens as compared to IMAX 70mm. So that is why choosing IMAX over any other lens is going to give you a much wider field of view and it's going to allow you to bring in most of your scene into your shot. Okay. Yeah. Now, one question may pop into your head that why don't we just decrease the focal length for this particular shot and have the same vertical field of view as IMAX? You may ask this question that why don't we just select this camera and we keep the Filmback settings at default, but somehow we decrease the focal length or we decrease or zoom out the lens and have the same field of view as IMAX. Okay, let me show you why you actually cannot do that. Now, if I decrease the focal length to a point where I have roughly the same vertical field of view as IMAX, maybe type in 38 at this point, you can now see that at the focal length of 38mm, we can now clearly see this asset in here. Okay, same is the case for the spaceship as well. You can now clearly see the image is not cropped out whatsoever. We can also clearly see this antenna or radar as well. And same is the case for this character as well. But the problem with lower focal length is that it introduces lens distortion. Okay. If I keep this value, I think beforehand it was just about there, maybe 52 or 53. You can now see that we don't have any sort of lens distortion in here. But if I decrease the focal length to get roughly the same vertical field of view as IMAX, you can now see that now we have a little bit of lens distortion in our shot. It may not be very noticeable right now, but let's see what happens if I bring this focal length down even further. If I bring this focal length way down, now you can see that we have this very weird curvy or curvature sort of distortion of lens, okay? And it looks absolutely horrible. It looks weird. It doesn't look good at all. So that is why you cannot just reduce the focal length to get the same vertical field of view as IMAX, okay? Let me repeat this again. Beforehand, we had the focal length of just about 52, okay? But the problem with that focal length was we didn't want to use IMAX. We wanted to use the default setting, okay? But the problem with the default setting was we just didn't have enough vertical field of view by using that lens. So when we decrease the focal length to have the same field of view as IMAX, the same vertical field of view as IMAX, you can now see that we have this lens distortion in here. And this lens distortion becomes even more noticeable when we bring this number way down. I know that at 37mm focal length, the distortion is not that visible, but it is actually there. So that is why we cannot just bring down the focal length to have the same vertical field of view as IMAX. Now let's say that another question pop into your head that why don't we just manually move this camera further away from this character to achieve the same field of view as IMAX? Let me show you why we actually cannot do that as well. If I change this to, let's say, 52, I think it was maybe just about somewhere around 52 or 53, maybe just about there. Okay, so to demonstrate this, I'm going to have to split the screen into 3 different windows. I'm going to go in here and select this layout. And in here, I'm going to change this to cinematic. I'm going to change this to cinematic as well. And for this window, I'm going to choose my camera that I have for my shot. And for the bottom window, I'm going to choose the demo camera. Okay. I'm going to enable real time for both of them. Okay, so let me show you what happens if you manually just move this camera away from this character to have the same field of view as IMAX. Now, if I move this camera further away, I'm gonna have to move this to maybe just about there, I guess, to have roughly the same field of view as IMAX. Okay, in the IMAX, you can see we can clearly observe this asset in here, and now same is the case with this one as well. But by moving the camera away from the scene to have the same vertical field of view, we can barely see our character in here. Okay, and the rest of the shot looks terrible as well. So that is why you cannot just move away your camera to have the same field of view as IMAX, because you're gonna have to move your camera so far away from your subject that your scene is gonna look awful. Okay, yeah, so let me reset the position of this camera. There we go. Let's go back and change the layout. I'm gonna select this layout, change this to camera 0, the camera for our shot, and I'm gonna change this to camera 1. So by now, hopefully you do understand why it is necessary to choose IMAX in here, because the IMAX gives you a much wider field of view. You're not gonna have any sort of lens distortion. You're not gonna have a cropped field of view. For this particular shot, IMAX 70mm is gonna give you the best possible cinematic looking results, okay? Yeah. So let's move on. Uh, we're gonna discuss the squeeze factor in the end. And right now I'm gonna discuss the focal length. Now, as you can see that I have a very big focal length of 160 millimeters for this particular shot, okay? While on the other hand, by default, this focal length is set to just 35 millimeter. So why do I have such a big focal length for this shot that we're gonna use as final render? Let me show you why. Now, if I select this camera, in here, and as we've already discussed that IMAX 70mm is going to give you best possible results. And now, as you can see, at a low focal length of 35mm, you can see that, let me enlarge this window. You can see that we have this huge amount of lens distortion in here. But if I increase this focal length, I need you to concentrate on this window while I increase the focal length. If I increase the focal length, you can see suddenly all of that lens distortion is just gone. Let me increase this to 10. Okay, so at the default focal length, you can now see that we have this huge amount of lens distortion in here. But if I increase this focal length to, let's say, 160, you can now see that our shot looks incredible. We don't have any sort of distortion in here. Okay, there is another reason for choosing such a high focal length. If I bring down the focal length to 35, you can now see that our background assets are far away from this camera. Yes, we do have the lens distortion as well, but these background assets are just far, far away from this camera. They are not popping into the camera at the moment, and so is this character. But if I increase this focal length, you can see not only it allows the lens to zoom in, but also enhances your background. It also pops your background into your camera. If I bring this number down to, let's say, 50, you can see all of these assets are pretty far, far away from the camera. But see what happens when I increase the focal length. If I increase the focal length, you can see these background assets are now popping into my camera. They are kind of enhancing and become more involved in our shot. Okay, so that is why it is necessary to choose a high focal length, because not only you get rid of lens distortion, but also your background just pops into your camera a little bit more. So that is why we need to have a very high focal length for our shot, especially because we're using such a wide lens as IMAX. In the previous lesson, I told you that all these settings are interlinked with each other. Okay. Now, if you choose a very wide lens, you're going to need a very high focal length for your shot. Okay. Let's say, for instance, if I have let me select this camera. Now, let's say, for instance, that I have a very smaller lens in here. Let's say the default lens. Okay. 16:9. We cannot very easily get away with a smaller focal length of 50, let's say. You can now see if I enlarge this window, we don't have any sort of lens distortion, and our background assets are also popping into the camera as well. But if I go for a very wide lens, such as IMAX, you can now see that we're not going to be able to get away with a smaller focal length if we have a wider lens, okay? We're going to need to increase this focal length to maybe, let's say 160, 150 or 130. Only then we're going to get rid of the lens distortion, and our background assets will also look more enhanced to the camera as well. So this is why I have a very big focal length of 160 millimeters for this shot, because I have a very wider lens, okay? If I choose a comparatively smaller lens such as digital film or DSLR, let's go for DSLR for instance, we can now easily get away with a focal length of maybe 50 or let's say 70 or let's say maybe 85 for this one, maybe somewhere around that number. But if we have a much wider lens such as IMAX, we're going to have to bring this number way up to, let's say, maybe just about 160, 150, somewhere around that. Okay. Please do let me know if you don't get any of these settings. I'll create a separate video for you to look at, and then I'll also add that video in the course. So if others are having the same problem, they can benefit from it as well. So next up, we have aperture in here. You can now see by default, this aperture is set to 2.8. Okay. But you can see for this particular shot, we have the aperture of 5. And the reason for that is aperture is actually a very highly arbitrary value. It depends on your scene, it depends on your shot, it depends on what you're looking for. So for this particular shot, you can see I have the aperture of 5. By default, you can see with the aperture of 2.8, everything that we have in the background is just completely blurred out. All those teeny tiny details that we've worked so hard for is just completely blurred out because of depth of field. So that is why I've set the aperture of this thing to 5. You can now see with the aperture of 5, we have some good amount of detail with our grass, with our assets that we place on top of the surface, with the cliffs, and with the minor assets as well, okay? So if I set this aperture to the default value, you can now see we don't have that kind of detail with our shot that we had beforehand. So that is why I've cranked this up to 5, okay? Now, one final thing that we're going to discuss before we actually complete today's video is the squeeze factor. We learned about squeeze factor in the previous lesson, but let's go over squeeze factor once again. Now, if I bring down this value to, let's say, let me select the demo camera. Now, if I set the squeeze factor to 1, you can see that we don't have much of a horizontal field of view at this point. But if I increase this number to 2, you can now see that horizontally we have a much wider field of view in here. So what actually happens is when we set the squeeze factor to 2, it takes all the image that I have in here and in here, and then it squeezes all that image into this particular small area, and then it stretches that image, hence giving you a wider field of view, okay? So that is why it is necessary to set the squeeze factor to 2, because this thing gives us a much wider field of view. It allows you to bring most of your scene into your shot, okay? So these were the few important settings for the camera. So that's it for this lesson, and in the next lesson, we're going to go through some more camera settings. So I'll see you guys in the next one.